It's the honest truth. Even your father-in-law must have heard about your blunders, right? It's downright unbearable. Sharing a meal with a poor woman who grew up in a single mother household like you? It's preposterous. You come from a different world than us. Please, just leave and wait outside. Understood. I'll leave. I politely said goodbye to the Johnson family and tried to leave. My name is Mary Johnson. I'm a 24-year-old working at Johnson Enterprises. As the secretary to the CEO, I've been employed here for about 2 years. I was actually invited to join the company by the CEO, Ronald Johnson, while I was still in college. We were in the same business class and ended up becoming good friends because our seats were side by side. Ronald is 30 years old, and we met when he was 24. He had already graduated from a 4-year college, but he was attending college again to deepen his knowledge as a business owner, it seems. He is quite the scholar. His father is the chairman of the Johnson Group. During his university years, Ronald took over his father's will and served as the president of Johnson Group Trading. He became an elite at a young age by becoming a president. My family, on the other hand, was extremely poor. My father was a gambling addict and a hopeless casino fanatic. The debts he incurred led to my parents' divorce when I was in elementary school. My mother raised me single-handedly. I want to somehow help my mother who has been struggling. With that feeling, I kept working hard at my studies. And then, Ronald, who learned about my situation, invited me to join his company, Johnson Trading. 2 years have passed since I joined the company and started working as Ronald's secretary. I have acquired secretarial and business document skills certification and am working hard for Ronald. By the way, Ronald Johnson, the president, is also my husband. Originally, I was interested in him during my university years and started dating after joining Johnson Trading. After a year of dating, I got married to Ronald. Ronald is a kind husband who, despite being a president, never acts arrogant and always takes care of me. I feel extreme happiness being able to be with him both at work and at home. I truly believe it was great that I met Ronald. Then came a certain day. A transfer notice was announced at Johnson Trading, and I couldn't hide my surprise at the name. The appointment of a vice president, and that name was Julia Johnson. I inadvertently frowned at the sight of the new vice president's name. I couldn't believe that the person I was not comfortable with was becoming vice president. This Julia Johnson is the wife of Ronald's brother, Billy Johnson. The reason she was promoted to vice president is because she has a proven track record of reviving companies in the Johnson Group. The performance of Johnson Trading has been declining year by year. Originally dealing mainly in food and clothing, the recent epidemic has resulted in a decline in sales. Ronald was in a frenzy, trying to recover the performance. but to no avail. Hence, the competent Julia Johnson was appointed as vice president. In other words, she is my sister-in-law. Why am I uncomfortable with this person? The reason goes back 1 year. I first met Julia at the wedding reception when Ronald and I got married. She was a very beautiful and cute woman, but when I greeted her, she just said, I got a really bad impression. Did I do something? When I tried to start a conversation with Julia, where are you from? Where am I from? I'm from Cincinnati. The moment she clicked her tongue. Do you not understand what I mean? I'm asking about your social status, not where you're from. Surely, you're not just a commoner, are you? I couldn't make sense of my conversation with her, and all I could say was, I am an ordinary citizen. Then she just disappeared without a word. I haven't seen Julia since then. The much anticipated day of the internal personnel change, X Day, arrived. Julia was appointed as vice president, and Ronald and I went to the station to pick her up. I was nervous about seeing her again after a long time. I didn't know what to say, so all I could say was, Julia, nice to meet you. She just said, oh, it's been a while. Got into the limousine arranged by Ronald and headed straight to Johnson Trading. When Ronald and I entered the president's office, I heard words from him that made me doubt my ears. He wanted me to be Julia's secretary. When I asked why me, he said it was because Julia had requested it. Apparently, Ronald couldn't refuse because she was his brother's wife. I reluctantly accepted when he pleaded with me. The job is the same as the president's secretary, managing the schedule, assisting with tasks, and answering the vice president's phone calls. However, since the person was my brother-in-law's wife and an unknown entity, I found it hard to do. Still, I had to do it. In the afternoon, I entered the vice president's office where Julia was. I greeted her and tried to start a conversation in the hope of getting along with her a little bit. I'm so glad that you're the vice president, Julia. I look forward to working with you. I greeted with a smile, but she said, I don't care about that. Just tell me tomorrow's schedule. I was initially angry, but I held it in, apologized with, I'm sorry, and explained it to her with my notebook. What's with this arrogant attitude? But she is a member of the Johnson family. I didn't want to cause a big trouble, and didn't want to cause trouble to Ronald, so I decided to do my job while holding back. That day, Ronald came home to the apartment when I got home. When I went to greet him at the entrance, he said, What's wrong? You look pale. I just responded with, I'm fine. I couldn't tell him after all. One day, I made a grave mistake. I accidentally swapped Ronald and Julia's schedules and only realized this when I received a phone call from Julia. She stated that she had not scheduled the meeting that I had told her about. Looking at the schedule, I saw that I had relayed the details of the meeting meant for Ronald to Julia instead. I realized my mistake, but it was too late by then. I was rebuked by Julia saying, I apologized to the client, but they didn't forgive me, and we lost a hard-won deal worth $200,000 because of you. She also lamented about the fact that she had to put up with unwanted advances from the lecherous president of the company we were dealing with to secure the deal, all of which ended up being for naught due to my error. Upon hearing that, Julia returned to the office. I immediately went to the president's office. I walked in, and first thing, I apologized deeply. But Julia shouted back, "Sorry isn't enough," her face as red as a demon's. I was at a loss for words when Ronald stepped in. "This time it's true that Mary is at fault, but there's nothing we can do about it now. Be careful next time." Ronald tried to mediate the situation, but Julia snidely remarked, "She'll just make the same mistake again. This is why uneducated commoners are useless." Upon hearing this comment, I recognized my fault, but wondered what she meant by not having a decent education. It felt like my personality and life were being denied, which fueled my irritation. But the mistake was mine. Unable to retort, I stayed silent. Then Ronald intervened. "That might be an overstatement." However, Julia turned away with a dismissive, After getting permission from Ronald to leave, I exited the president's office. I went to the company cafe to reflect, pondering why I made the mistake. Just then, Julia walked in. I rushed to her, saying, "Julia, I'm sincerely sorry for what happened." I apologized without caring who was around. "I'm forgiving you this time because the president asked me to. But don't think there will be a next time. I can fire a commoner like you anytime." This was the last straw. I understand and accept my mistake. But what does being a commoner have to do with anything? Excuse me, is being a commoner relevant here? What? Who are you to argue? If you had a proper education, you wouldn't have made such a mistake. Well, I think my mistake and my home environment are unrelated. Is there something against commoners? I inadvertently confronted Julia. She sighed as if exasperated and said, "Never mind." Then she walked away. A week later, Ronald, Julia, and I were set to attend the head office's executive meeting. We had a pre-meeting lunch as the meeting was scheduled in the afternoon. After thoroughly checking the topics and materials, I felt well prepared this time. As our meeting neared conclusion and Ronald left for the restroom, I also went to the restroom at that time. I felt nervous about attending the meeting with Julia, fearing more criticisms. I felt a salty taste as I sipped the water in my glass, but dismissed it as my imagination and finished the drink to quench my thirst. We joined the executive meeting at 3 p.m. The meeting progressed smoothly, but suddenly, I felt an urge to use the restroom. The feeling was so strong that I could hear my stomach rumbling. There was no way I could hold it in. Yet, I didn't have the courage to interrupt this solemn meeting by declaring, "Excuse me, restroom," and rushing out. Regardless of my reluctance, the urge to go kept tormenting me. "Ronald, everyone, I'm sorry." Before facing the deluge, the disaster, the guerrilla rainstorm, I'm sorry. I rushed out of the meeting room and into the restroom, where I stayed for nearly 30 minutes. Everything was over, and I opened the door and stepped outside. I was feeling incredibly unwell from dehydration and exhaustion. It seemed that the meeting was over too, and Ronald and Julia were sitting in the company cafe. Ronald was looking at me with concern, but Julia had a smirk on her face. That's when a suspicion crossed my mind. The water I had drunk earlier had a strong, salty taste. When I returned from the toilet and sat down, clutching my stomach, Ronald asked me if I was okay. But Julia just said, "Did you eat something weird and get food poisoning?" in a sarcastic tone. Could it be that she mixed a laxative in while I was gone? But why? Would she do something like that? Out of anger for the lost deal? I don't know, but I did have diarrhea after drinking that water. I found myself plunged in doubt and suspicion. Ronald told me, "Go home and rest today." So I decided to go home. The diarrhea was better, but my stomach hurt. I laid my head on the cafe table until I calmed down. After a while, the pain subsided and I decided to head home. But before that, I had to inform the vice president of tomorrow's schedule. I headed to the vice president's office and knocked on the door. When I did, I heard Julia's voice saying, "Come in." When I entered the room, she said, "Oh, it's you." Of course, she didn't bother asking about my health. "What do you want? Make it quick, I'm busy." "Julia, you put something in the water, didn't you?" At my question, Julia smirked and said, "What are you talking about?" Don't play dumb. At lunchtime, when Ronald and I left our seats, didn't you mix something in my glass? Oh my, what a sudden accusation! It's completely unreasonable to blame others. Get out of here, you fool! Furthermore, I saw a box of laxatives on her desk. When Julia noticed my gaze, she said, "Well, I might as well tell you the truth. Yes, I mixed a drug into your glass." "Why would you do such a thing? What did I ever do to you? Why have you been like this since we met?" "It's simple. Because you're a commoner, that's all. You're unnecessary to the Johnson family." Her flippant reason for considering me a commoner left me not just angry, but dumbfounded. And tears welled up in my eyes. "Unfortunately, I'll have to fire you. No matter how much you tell the president about me, you have no evidence, so it's impossible. Plus, if you consult anyone, you'll be making an enemy of the Johnson family. A rift will form between my husband Billy and Ronald, and the brotherly relationship will become the worst because of you. If you're okay with that, feel free to consult." She was right. If I told Ronald, the Johnson family would be in turmoil. I had no choice but to endure in silence. Tears of frustration wouldn't stop. and I navigated through the blurry vision to head home. Ronald worried about my sobbing figure. I wanted to talk, but if I did, things would get serious. Ronald asked, "What happened? Is it about Julia?" He hit the nail on the head. After much hesitation, I said, "Actually, Julia..." I ended up talking about everything, the past events and the incidents at today's meeting. Once I started speaking, I couldn't stop, and I ended up speaking my mind. And then I couldn't stay in the Johnson family anymore. But it was because of me that a major deal fell through. I was just a drag. "Ronald, I'm sorry. Let's get divorced. If I'm gone, you can stay good with Billy, with Julia. I'm an unnecessary person." "Don't despair. I'm no good without Mary. I love Mary. I want you by my side every moment. That's why I made you my secretary. So please, don't leave me. Don't talk about such sad things like breaking up." One day, at the end of the year, Ronald asked me to come to a dinner party where the entire Johnson family would gather. Of course, Julia would be there. I decided to go to the dinner party. After all, it was an important event. And then I made up my mind and left the house. The staff greeted me and showed me the way. My in-laws, Billy, and Julia were already at the table. I greeted everyone. Of course, Julia acted sullenly with a It was an expected attitude. When Ronald and I sat down, Julia first said, "I feel sick." "I really feel sick. Having dinner with this poor trash? It pollutes the atmosphere. It will spoil caviar we are going to have." At this statement, my father-in-law said, "What are you talking about?" in anger. "It's the truth. You must have heard about her gaffe too, right? It's so annoying. It's not a joke to have dinner with a commoner from a single mother household. You're from a different world. Just go out. It's better if you wait outside." Understood, then. I said bye to everyone in the Johnson family and was about to leave. I heard my father-in-law suddenly yell, "Then you should go home." "What? What do you mean, father-in-law?" "No ifs or buts. You're the unnecessary one in the Johnson family." "What are you talking about, father-in-law? I am the vice president of Johnson Corporation and Billy's wife." She seemed to want to argue, but my father-in-law shook his head and said, "It seems Billy wants to divorce you." At that word, Julia glared at Billy. "Billy, is that true?" "Yes. I'm tired of your high-handed attitude that looks down on people, and you don't do any housework. You're good at your job and there are parts I respect, but otherwise, you're done as a human being. You're the one who's in the way." What? Furthermore, it seems like my father-in-law had heard from Ronald about what Julia had done to me so far. The fact that Billy didn't like her, and about me. My father-in-law seemed to have planned to cut ties with Julia at this opportunity. That's what the dinner was for. "Don't say such ridiculous things. After all, father-in-law, Do you have any proof? The proof that I made Mary sick." At this time, I thought it was time for revenge. Everyone in the Johnson family is on my side. There's nothing to fear. I remembered on the spur of the moment and pulled out the pen I always stick in my chest. Then, Julia made a puzzled face and then laughed out loud. "What are you thinking, showing such a thing?" Her complacency will end now. Without any hesitation, I pressed the switch on the pen. "Don't play dumb. Didn't you mix something into my glass when Ronald and I left our seats during lunch?" When my voice played, Julia's face turned pale. "Yes, this pen is not just a pen. It's a pen-type recorder. It's always recording to not forget the content of conversations at negotiations and meetings." Thinking that there might be something, I kept Julia's voice as evidence. And now was the perfect time to play it. Julia covered her face with both hands and was trembling. "It's not over yet, Julia. You didn't really marry Billy out of love. You married him to expand the Lee Group's power, didn't you?" What are you talking about?" Then Ronald took out his smartphone and started playing a certain voice recording. "That poor woman is unnecessary to the Lee Group. Instead, I will incorporate the Johnson Group into the Lee Group eventually." Suddenly, Julia covered her face and screamed, "Stop! I feel so..." Was this her soliloquy? "In doing so, my status will rise even higher. How secure." After that, a long conversation that seemed like Julia's monologue continued. "Once I become the next president of Johnson Corporation, I can frequent high-end male strip clubs even more than now." And the recording also contained her calling out names of her favorite strippers, saying, "I love you," and "I adore you." Hearing this, Billy showed his anger. "You're obsessed with strippers." Why did she feel embarrassed after the voice recording was played? The Lee Group that Julia mentioned is a rival of the Johnson Group. She originally was the daughter of the Lee Group. However, it was said that she had a love marriage with Billy. But that seemed to be different. She might have been forced into a political marriage as a spy for the Lee Group. "You will divorce Billy and be dismissed as the vice president. Furthermore, we will completely withdraw from the Lee Group. We have been getting along through mutual encouragement, but this is a total break." Julia's face turned pale. Furthermore, the mother-in-law, who had been listening to the whole thing, opened her mouth. "Julia, you called Mary a poor person and a commoner, but what I can't forgive the most is that you denied that she was raised in a single-parent family. I, too, was poor and raised in a single-parent family when I was young. You don't know the human heart. You're the one who's not needed." It was the first time I had seen the mother-in-law so angry. I was surprised, as she always gave me a gentle and smiling impression. Everyone's gaze gathered on Julia. She pounded the table with both hands and stood up vigorously. "Remember this! The Lee Group will never forgive you!" She spat out this parting shot and left the restaurant. Honestly, my heart felt very relieved. Everyone protected me. I no longer needed to leave the Johnson family. As I felt relieved, tears began to flow. Seeing this, Ronald and my parents-in-law and Billy all comforted me. 2 weeks after the dinner party, a call came from the chairman of the Lee group. I remembered Julia's words. The Lee group will never forgive you. However, the contents of the call were unexpected. I sincerely apologize for the tremendous inconvenience my daughter, Julia, has caused you. The chairman himself had made an apology call. Apparently, he had heard the detailed story from the chairman of the Johnson Group, my father-in-law, and when he asked Julia, she readily admitted to it. The Lee Group does not think about crushing the Johnson Group at all. This trouble is my responsibility as a parent. I am truly sorry. It turned out that everything had started from Julia's delusion. Moreover, the reason why Julia mixed that thing from me seemed to be a grudge against my previous rebuttal. Does being a commoner matter? It seemed that she couldn't stand being told various things by me, a commoner, even though she was in the upper class. She is indeed a woman with high pride. Some time passed and I received another invitation to a high-end restaurant for my in-laws. I went to the restaurant with Ronald. The place was the same restaurant as before. There, my in-laws were already present, and the four of us gathered around the table. My father-in-law tried to order. Then, 2 staff members came over, and I was surprised to see one of them. The staff member was none other than Julia. Why are you guys here? Why are you working here? I have no choice. My father told me to gain experience in customer service and learn about society. Really, even though I, a lady, have to do this. She turned red in the face with anger, and the stern-looking male staff behind her said, "Hey, don't keep the customers waiting. Take their orders." Yes, I'm sorry. She was almost in tears as she took the order. Honestly, it was very funny. The dish was delivered, and while we were enjoying its taste, we heard the male staff yelling again. When I looked in the direction of the voice, Julia was crying and apologized to the male staff. It seemed that she was being scolded for making mistakes in orders and behaving rudely to customers. We ate the delicious food while laughing at the sight of her, who had changed so much.